thank you so much for coming along on this slightly less sunny day than it has been up to now. My name is Lucy Durneen. I say I'm a short story writer. I actually feel that's something that I'm not really identifying with so much anymore, but it's where I began my writing career as a short story writer. But I've also, in the last, 5 to 10 years, been moving into writing poetry and writing short form creative non-fiction, mostly in the form of lyric essays. But I'm also interested in a lot of hybrid forms that involve the visual arts and writing. And I think even when that doesn't manifest in actual visual work, it's always somehow in my writing in some way, this kind of focus on the visual. I also teach creative writing, and I've been doing that now for about 20 years. But it's really nice to actually drop back into my writing body for a bit, because sometimes I get so used to talking about how to write that I actually forget to think about why it is that I write. So for my passion for words, I wanted to talk a little bit about, first of all, I suppose why is it that I'm writing? But also because I found over the last few years, we've been in a very difficult time globally. I found it very difficult to write, actually. So I wanted to talk about those difficulties and also overcoming them and what that's done in my work. And I wanted to focus this time on poetry, because it is the form that I'm finding is been leading me through these, I guess you could call them catastrophic times. And actually it's now a lecture that I give to my students at the start of term. The course that I teach has 4 modules, which starts with poetry, and we do that very deliberately because we know most of our students are terrified of poetry, and they come to us and they're quaking and they call it their most feared module. And we think, well, let's get them, just throw them in there, baptism of fire, let's do it. But the first lecture I give them now focuses on a different question, which is, why are we writing poetry in times of catastrophe? Why? What can poetry bring to us? Because sometimes it seems to me as if the concerns we might have about, the heartbreaks we experience, or the difficulties that our own small lives have brought us, how do they actually measure up against, the pandemic, against war, against civil rights injustice? All of these questions started to make me feel like my own little questions in poetry didn't have a place in the world in some way. But then I started to sort of resituate that when I read a poem by Katie Farris. I don't know if anyone has read any of her poetry. She's married to the Ukrainian poet Ilya Kaminsky, and she wrote this poem to Ilya I think it was in 2021, and it's called Why Write Love Poetry in a Burning World. And the last line of the poem is, to find what isn't hell in the midst of hell. And as I read this poem, she wrote it to him as a personal thing, and he put it on Facebook, and it went viral, and everyone was talking about this poem. And at the same time, she was going through a diagnosis of breast cancer, so there was her own personal journey to face alongside the bigger global journey that everyone was going through with the pandemic. And her question was, why write poetry in a burning world? And it's the first question I now ask my students at the start of the year. And it meant that I had to ask myself the same question. Why am I writing poetry at this time? And it might be a question I would want to put to you, maybe something that you would ask yourselves in your own mind. And I don't think I've got a specific answer, but what it made me realize was that the question isn't resolved, therefore it means I have to keep writing. So instead of having this kind of period where I felt that everything I was writing was kind of irrelevant or just too kind of solipsistic or indulgent in some way, that my anxieties were really indulgent, I started to realize that actually poetry has been doing this since people started to write poetry. This question of, say, love and war, the tension between these kind of two, love and anger, love and aggression, all of these difficulties that we experience in the world have been set against love poetry since people have been trying to write. So it's not a new question, it's not something that we're kind of grappling with for the first time, but it's been, in a sense, it feels like poetry's responsibility to try and kind of find those moments of beauty in the burning world, because it seems to me the world has been burning for much longer than we're kind of aware of it right now. And this for me was really difficult during the pandemic. I actually, for the first time in my life, felt like I might never write again, which was really scary because I first told my dad I wanted to write when I was 3 years old. So it was all I'd ever actually thought about doing was being a writer. I'd never thought about any other career. My mum would sort of kind of take me to one side and say, well, what are you really going to do? Like, what's your actual job going to be? And I would always just say, I'm going to be a writer. So without that kind of feeling of that as my identity, I felt very lost. But I couldn't write. It just wasn't coming. What I did for a while, during those first days of lockdown, in the UK, we had a very harsh lockdown where we were, in 2020, I think it was March that it began, and sometime around the end of May when we were finally allowed to leave our homes. So I took pictures of the tree outside my window every single day. Just all I could manage to do was just keep watching this tree. And over the course of March to May, I saw it move into spring, and by May it was full of leaves, and this tree was continuing to grow. And I was thinking about the age of this tree, and this sense that this tree probably existed before my house had existed. I knew my house was 120 years old, so the tree might be 200 years old. Like, what things had my tree seen that were worse than the thing that I was experiencing now, locked in my bedroom down in Cornwall, where I live, in the west coast of England. And I guess something in the act of watching the tree felt a little like a kind of poetry. It was a moment of noticing, so it felt like it was the most I could manage at that time, was to just keep looking. And I've come back to that in my mind as I began to write again, that if we can just keep looking, then I think we're still kind of, even though we can't change the events that we're witnessing, or even though we can't impact them necessarily in the way we want to, we can keep noticing, and we can record, and we can witness. And if that's the thing we can do as poets, and we can say, we were here and we saw this, then to me it seems that maybe that's enough for now. There's a line by a songwriter, Regina Spektor. I don't know if anyone knows the songs of Regina Spektor. I always get it wrong, so I've had to write it down because I can't sing, and you kind of have to be Regina Spektor to really pull this off. But it's a song called On the Radio. And at some point in that song, she says, you take that love you made and you stick it into someone else's heart, pumping someone else's blood. And it felt to me that poetry is that. You're taking something that you made and you're sticking it into someone else's heart, pumping someone else's blood. And the line continues, I can't remember how it continues. You hope it don't get harmed, but even if it does, you'll just do it all again. And so for me, this act of poetry is, you put this thing that you've created into someone's heart. You know that you're not them. You know they're not going to feel it the same way that you felt it. But all you can do is hope that in that act of giving it to them, the thing that you saw, the beautiful thing you saw, won't be lost. And you will, even if you fail on that attempt, you try again. So that song to me kind of symbolized what it was that I could do. All I could do was keep trying to notice the things that I saw in these difficult times and put them into a form that someone else could take, and I could only hope that maybe they would have the same kind of sense of being moved by them too. And perhaps in that way we're kind of creating some sort of connected network of feeling, I suppose, that maybe that's a resistance against the catastrophe, perhaps. I've become really interested actually in this kind of idea that the heart, the electromagnetic rhythms of the heart, can be detected by other hearts. It's, all of us here in this room, our hearts are kind of synchronizing. We're not really going to be aware of it unless we, intrude on each other's personal spaces and put our hands on our chests. But the more we sit in a space like this with somebody, our heart rhythms will continue to sync into the same kind of beat. And a heart can detect another heart from, I can't remember the distance, but a heart can recognize another heart in its vicinity. So Poetry, love poetry particularly. Well, not particularly, but my students are often writing love poetry, so I talk to them about this. Has that, for me, that same kind of sort of weird electromagnetic connection. It's like a pulse we're sending out, perhaps, and then maybe we're connected by it. I thought I'd read I've got a couple of poems that I wanted to read because one of them was about trying to, it's not about trying to write again after not being able to write for a long time, but it is the product of the slow kind of recovery from not being able to write. And I thought it works a little bit like an essay. So for those of you who are just talking about lyric essays with me this morning, this time I'm calling it a poem, but I think it's actually possibly an essay. And it was taken from notes that I wrote during a lecture by the poet Banu Kapil, and her lecture was on difficulty. And I started to make these notes, and then the notes began to form a poem. And at that point, that was the first moment when I started to write poetry again in this kind of strange time of lockdown and feeling like I had nothing to say to contribute to the world. So I don't think this poem is necessarily contributing to the world, but for me it was charting the questions that I was trying to ask myself. It was keeping things moving. It was exercising a poetic muscle, I suppose you could say. Now, I haven't mastered the art of writing short poems, so I think they probably take about 5 minutes to read each of these poems. So I'll read one and then another later. That's why I think I have a friend who said that I'm not a poet because the poems that I write do not look like poetry. But I think part of my question, in a sense, in thinking of why I'm writing is to get away from the sense of having to define ourselves as writers and to say that, who's to say that this is a poem or not a poem? Who's to say that a poem has to look a particular way? Which means who's to say that a poem has to perform a particular function? But this is the poem that I wrote slowly. I felt like a baby, taking small steps back to working with a form that had become unfamiliar to me. And it's called Notes, written during a lecture on difficulty. Because, poetry is hard. It's hard to write, isn't it? It's like, I think if we are honest with ourselves, it's difficult and we should give ourselves a break. Part 1. There are things you can tell people only at night. Slow things, like learning the difficulty of speaking across absences. Or how you wrote a poem for the beloved when you were no longer beloved. Or how you found a poem by the beloved when you thought they had stopped writing about love. The blank page deep in your chest both transmits and receives what needs to be communicated. But sometimes it can't. Sometimes 5 years pass and it all remains unwritten. At night, the heart can pause up to 15 seconds before beating again. So what if something like a sentence got caught in the gap? Part 2. The emphasis is always on the knowable world of pleasure, how to get out from under the right way. I am learning that pleasure is a legitimate reaction. I am learning it is okay not to be afraid of looking back at the crystallized thought. I am learning to sit with rage over difficulty, to differentiate pure pleasure from the feeling evoked by a cliché. Perhaps it is okay to write pleasure 3 times. The artist and the reader are engaged in a dance the artist is always leading. Some of us are happiest in the space between where the body is and the body is not, in the white space that is about who the work is for. And the footnote would be, but who is listening? Question: what is the water of your poem? Did you even notice how I am performing the girl as a ghost, girl only as afterthought, overcompensating? You can be liminal in an arrivals hall or in folk tales, but not on government documentation. Did you notice? Can we talk a little about state-dependent memory, a place that connects you to all of time? Different environments ask different things of us. For example, in the forest, I am compelled to read Rilke. For example, you don't expect a person with migraine to make you coffee in the morning. You can eat a picnic by a lake, unless there is someone drowning in the lake. Part 3. What would you tell a person if you could not see them? It's hard to know what seeds deceit has stuck to the tongue. And yes, I know I said I would not go back into the underworld, but it was a lie. I'd forgotten. Orpheus actually turns around. Just a man deciding he would rather see his beloved than any future the gods could promise. A scattering of clothes on the floor is a kind of myth. They were not my clothes, which was the first indication I do not exist in the future promised by the gods. Your tongue wettening on the plosive of her name. I cannot think of your hands running over the spines on her window ledge, but I do, which only means, yes, it is impossible to live with what is good for art. In the lecture hall, we all agree this is true. What happened when you came up for air beside the outline of her body, your soft white bed, the fan blowing gently? I long to ask the ancestor poets, but I do not know if they would want to speak to me. They suggest an essay on silence, a poetics that pulls in more than itself. They say, write to describe your bones. Part 4. I could call this Notes Written During a Lecture on Difficulty, or I could call it My Heart Has Slown Way Down. You said everything is connected, so let me shoehorn in a torus field, a line about how the heart already knows how to beat in step with every other human heart in the living world. Or pause and beat again into a world crowded with impossible things. A form is chosen not for its weight, but for what it can hold. The page, for instance, is a zone of entanglement, of intimacy, asking us to draw shut its door. But the line is what trains us to listen for the silent click. If you plan to heal me by sucking the dark blood from my body, remember, the site of the crisis can lie far from the wound. I ask for signs, and the signs are delivered. Or maybe they are not signs when you ask for them the way I asked for them. Another way to put this is that any part of ourselves we will not try to turn into art. Do I consent to feel the way the writer has asked me to feel? When I try to stop writing of love, I have only found myself writing harder of love. What if Orpheus had just kept walking? Or if Rilke had told us to stay home, where Schrecken couldn't touch us? Let's cry together, because so much of a story is simply our refusal to behave. And anyway, the terror sleeps in our own beds. Your greatest fear, I want to know it. Mine lies deep in the water of this poem, its gesture that in making has now become irreversible. So that was, and I say I started to write that during this lecture, and it was the first kind of crawling back towards being able to feel I had something that I needed to communicate after this time of lockdown and this time of feeling, emotionally blindsided from every side in those years, like I'm sure we've all felt. But actually the truth is that the poem arrived in one shape, and then, as these things do, it took a while to grow and evolve, and it was probably finished at the end of last year, I would say. So it had a life of about maybe 2 years in full of actually growing and figuring itself out and what it wanted to say. And it started life as a prose poem. Then it changed into, I guess, a pattern poem. Then it changed into couplets. And finally, I don't think you can see here, but I've kind of broken it into these 4 sections. And instead of punctuation, I'm using forward slashes and just kind of like just cutting the line, just here. I'm going to be led by breath, more almost like musical notation. And I'm still not sure if I'm happy with that. But it's kind of it was a way for me of processing some of my concerns, some of my sense of do the stories I have to tell have any relevance in today's world, and who are my influences, and who are the people I want to speak to in my poetry. So for me it was a kind of I guess in a way you can call it artistic research. It's a kind of a way of trying to find out the thing through writing the thing. So maybe that makes it a poem, maybe it's an essay, maybe it's none of those things, I don't know. But it's helped me start to articulate why I needed to start writing again and why it was important. And I think for my students it's important too that if we can't make changes on the macro level, we can make these small little changes, and maybe if even just an exchange between one other person with our words can make a difference, and that can have a different kind of impact. The other thing that I found for me that poetry was able to do in those difficult lockdown years was talk to other poets by reading poetry. So I found myself reading other poets, like in conversation, reading them for guidance, kind of going back to them to see if they had the answers. I read a lot of Ada Limon in that time. I don't know if anyone has read her poetry. I don't know if anyone else had that experience during, of kind of turning to poetry over the last few years as a kind of like, is there an answer somewhere that I can find, or is there a kind of notes of guidance somewhere in this to be seen? But then I realised actually that's something I've been doing for a long time. In fact, maybe that's the only way I've ever known how to write poetry, is to try and talk to other poets and try and engage with their ideas. And I don't think I've ever written poetry that isn't trying to explicitly talk to somebody. Now that I think about it, I'm always addressing somebody in the poetry that I write. Maybe that's why they end up being these long rambling things, because it's like a one-sided conversation, and I'm not getting any answers, of course, so I have to kind of write in the answers, and in the end I'm just talking to myself. But that feeling, I think that sometimes maybe poetry is this kind of this very personal thing that we're just trying to sort of well, Ted Hughes talked about being delivered, poetry being something we have to be delivered of. Like there's something inside us, we have to get it out, we have to sort of, almost like a kind of a birth that comes out of us. But for me, I've never found that it's something inside me, it's something that I need to ask someone else to clarify for me. It's like, it's, I have a problem here and I need to talk it out with somebody. Who am I going to choose? And it's often this kind of, this implied reader in a poem that I'm asking to help me, I think. The first experience I really had of that, and Mel will remember this because this happened during our first residency here in Tranås in 2015, where that was when I discovered the poetry of Nazim Hikmet, and that was, to my shame, the first time I'd ever read his words. But I found myself talking to him a lot in my head as I walked around this town. And then I, for the first time, read his poem, Things I Never Knew I Loved. And in doing that, I just found myself taking issue with some of the things that he loved, or wanting to know more about some of these things, or finding myself kind of getting fired up. And so I really wanted to talk to him more than I've ever wanted to talk to anyone, I think. And I started writing this poem, which I started here in Tranås. Then I think, God, that poem must have taken, I feel like it took 4 years maybe to kind of find its way. It starts with a date, but that date really kind of changed in the end because I kept coming back to it and rewriting it. But it was always about this kind of experience of, if you like, meeting Nazim in this town and what that meant to me, this kind of weird, unexpected encounter with a dead poet in a tiny little town that I'd never been to before. And although I didn't realize it at the time, some of the things I explored in that poem have come back to me since, in this kind of period of writing difficulty where everything felt too much. I thought, well, Nazim, you did it. you didn't, I think of the poets who have held poetry in their mouths and spoken them into the ears of other people because they can't be written down because it's too dangerous. They've kept they've smuggled poetry over borders. They've hidden poetry in the ground and dug it up because it's not safe. Anna Akhmatova, recalling, having to memorize her poems because it was too dangerous to write them down for posterity. Or even not even just for posterity, just to write them down, even just in the moment. This notion of the courage of poets to kind of, in the face of catastrophe, encounter it, observe it, and do whatever was necessary to hold on to the words and to hold on to the things that they had seen, which kind of then made me feel really small, because I was just like, well, who am I moaning about? I can't write because I'm like locked in my room and I've only got Netflix, and it's like, yeah, this isn't exactly the same thing at all. But yeah, that poem, and I apologise, some people in the room I know have heard it before, and you've probably heard it many times before, but I wanted to read it again because I feel like, well, in a way, it's my love letter to Sweden. It's also a love letter to Turkey, where I have never been. So to all the Turkish writers here and filmmakers, one, apologies for my bad Turkish. It will not be pronounced well, I'm sorry. I will do my very best. Also, it's a kind of a promise that I will visit, and it's a love letter to Nazim, and I hope that in some way he kind of knows that. I think I'm not very good at saying I'm a poet, if I'm honest. I started by saying I'm a short story writer, which I haven't written a short story for a while, but I can't say I'm a poet. I just can't do it. And I had a friend who took me into the middle of Cambridge and said, like, you will stand in this street and you will shout, I am a poet. And I was like, I can't do it. I couldn't. And she was like, the best I could do was like a squeak that just kind of came out in like the middle of the Market Square in Cambridge. But if there was ever a moment that I felt, you know what, maybe I can say that, maybe I can say I'm a poet, it was this poem, it was this town, it was this encounter with another poet. And it's why I think it's important that we don't stop writing even when we feel it's hard, because we don't know. He doesn't know that how many years since he died. Was it 64, 62, 64 that he died? How would he know that the impact he would have had on one random English person, and how that would have changed the course of their own writing? So that's why maybe that's one of the reasons we have to write through the catastrophe. So this poem, in response to Things I Never Knew I Loved, is called There Are No Small Things. It's the 2nd of January 2016. I'm writing this for future reference. It's a small thing, but there will be a time when it seems impossible this date was once the present. I thought it hardly worth remembering snow on the roof of a Smålands church beside the road to Stockholm, the quiet of it like a mute sea. But on the bus to the airport, I was reading you, Nazim, so I noticed. And now I'm afraid of forgetting it. I'm not a person who has much faith in anything, even memory. I didn't know poplars were Turkish. Poplars are the English fens where I was born, in a city whose cathedral they called a ship. Beyond lines of poplar, I sailed from one waterland into another. I wonder if this is why sometimes I taste salt for no reason. I am afraid of forgetting so many things. For instance, leaning out of the window to hear La Composita from the cafe on the corner of Rosenthaler and Weinmeisterstrasse. I want to call those Berlin nights voluptuous, but this was when I had stopped loving voluptuousness. It was here I lost my wallet once. The man who found it told me to collect it from an apartment in Kreuzberg, and I did. And at the doorstep, he asked me to come inside, and I did that too. And while I was waiting, the front door closed, and the thing that happened next is the thing women are always afraid will happen. There is nothing wrong with comparing nightfall to a bird, Nazim. It is exactly the right way to describe the slow, feathered sinking of darkness. Before the Nazis, before the Soviet patrols, Brecht would walk along this street to his house near the Spree. to one lover or another, whistling tombalalaika with his hand in his pocket and the stage in his head. War is like love. It always finds a way. Two things we will never stop writing of: love and war. At times like this, you see it's true. The one who loves less is always loved most. It's such a small thing, but I am always using words whose meanings I have not lived. I have a problem with nouns that mix Greek and Latin roots, for example. But not everything has to be named. By the way, I want to ask the precise word for the candlelight in the Litteraturcentrum, the way you would describe the tiny lanterns of the dead in its churchyard, the shudder of flames beside snow. I wonder how you would put it. Sometimes it takes the tail lights of a Volvo to understand all the things you have lost. There was someone who could quote Selimovic. There was someone who stole pens. Aziz survived genocide. I thought I loved tea, but I wasn't drinking it the Turkish way then. So many beautiful untold stories, and my heart a storm inside them all. Sometimes we cannot write because we are too busy being alive. It's good to remember this, especially when you see yourself in a dark window, on a train perhaps, when you think, this is who I am. And yet you cannot touch this person, or you will break the illusion, the charm. There is a man I knew in old Istanbul, full of stories that brew in him like tea in a glass pot. I'm thinking of him now on the bus to Arlanda. I've never been to Kadıköy. I've never seen the Sea of Marmara, so I have no idea how blue he was talking. I have no idea how blue. It was a small thing made bigger in translation. Okyanus Gujlum, my ocean-eyed. I was never so close to anyone in my life, you said, Nazim. And you were thinking of Vera on the road to the Crimea. Like objects in a rear-view mirror, I didn't know how close. What I'm saying is, when you go to these seas, you do not think about the dangers. I thought maybe I would forget the time Lilia drove me through Vienna in the dark, through the famous woods to the Kahlenberg, and the view that is exactly as everyone imagines. 7 ascending miles in a small French car for the views of the blue Danube. Lilia's Donaf. Blue is the light of distance, the edge of the spectrum that longs for but doesn't quite reach Earth. The world in cyanotype, the stars. Nazim, you wondered about them. Emerson said if we only saw the night sky once in our lives, we'd never stop talking about it, that we tire of the miraculous. But I haven't yet. There were 6 of us in the car, in our dinner clothes, my tight red dress, Aziz by the window. I was never so close to anyone in my life. I was thinking of the city he had left, the war inside it. Lilia would only take the skinny ones, she said, which meant we couldn't all get to see the plaster-pale skin of the church and the broken moon and the blue midnight stumbling river telescoping to Solina. More beauty than I could bear. This was before I knew about Yakamos, so who is to say I had ever experienced beauty? Or if I did, it was the way a bird would experience it. Yes, like night falling. When everything seems less than it really is, as if from a distance, or exiled. Even love can be this way sometimes. I remember now how the edges of the world are no longer blue when you arrive there. But the most beautiful word in the world translates as the reflection of the full moon on the sea on a bright and cold night without any waves, which proves the most beautiful things are not so far away. Memory, for example, which is only ever the space between things. I was thinking of how even constellations and iambs are things I could have loved, or certain arrangements of notes on a clarinet, a particular use of adverbs. It's impossible to believe anyone could ever get tired of this, but once is never enough, Nazim. It is not enough to know the things you love, to name the stars. You want others to name them too. I am worn out with desire. It's not a small thing to give a person a book, something large and expanding pushed deep into the dark machinery of the heart. There was a ballerina who danced for a dying man on New Year's Eve. Each pirouette a sigh for the living world, a waltz into the blue. And when she was asked why would you do that? Such a small thing on this night of all nights, she said. Because there are no small things. No thing means nothing. No word is too small. No space in the world too small. There are children spinning through the gyres of the Aegean. The measure of freedom is in what we can run away from. But the borders are closing soon. I arrived too late. And now the snow above Arlanda falls heavy, and the plains, the soaring plains like tired birds, have suddenly nowhere to go.